Hello to all my queers and dears, and welcome back. We're doing this again, I suppose. Uh, okay, so we were just past an hour, which means there's about an hour and a half left in this damn thing. Let's get started. I don't know if I'll be able to do everything tonight, but well, let's get as much done as we can, eh?
Too, and a lot of the character and relationship stuff.
Just need to make sure that that's working, of course. What was that? How did I have it set up before? Like, I had it set up so that I could... Just double checking the sound. Hello to all my queers and dears. Well, let's get as much done as we can, eh?
Too, and a lot of the character and relationship.
Okay, sounds like everything's working. Well then, let's get started. This is, before we just get started, this is a reminder that we are approaching this in as good a faith as we can. We are not doing any allegations. We are not assuming hbomberguy is a bad person. We are not even going to assume that he is deliberately doing anything harmful here. We are simply trying to understand. Well, we're watching the video and we're analyzing how it comes across and why it's harmful, and why RWBY fans in particular are still upset about it, and still, you know, even like 4 years later, the RWBY fans still feel affected by it. And you know, why it's frankly just not good work, and the impact that it's had. That's all the stuff we're looking at. That's all the stuff we're looking at. But we're not commenting on hbomberguy as a person. I need that to be understood. I'm not accusing him of anything. I'm not saying he's... Yeah, I'm not saying anything bad about him. I'm only analyzing this video and what it says, whether he meant it to say that or not.
Happening in the prom scenes is, like, fine. The problem with the scene is, even if it's perfect, it's yet another thing that's happening instead of a story. It just becomes aggravating knowing you're watching all of this and basically still waiting for the plot to start again. And you know how it starts again? Well, right at the end of the episode before the final 2 of the season, the ground suddenly opens up under RWBY's feet and she falls into the plot. Watching this show...
Okay, just a quick little thing here. He's actually had footage from it before, but actually, there is major plot relevance during the dance. Like, major. There's been little clips from it before in the video, but, Cinder, who has infiltrated Beacon at this point, along with, her, at the time, henchmen, Mercury and Emerald, have infiltrated Beacon, and during the dance, when everyone is like distracted, Cinder sneaks into I think it's Ozpin's office. No, maybe not. She sneaks into some, important place and plants a virus that will allow her to take control of uh, all of the Atlas technology and use it in Volume 3 for you know disaster, true serious horrible things. Um, that all happens during the dance. That's all pretty important story. Also, RWBY, in terms of what he was just saying about her literally about to fall into the plot, just for a point, right? During the dance, RWBY leaves the dance and pursues Cinder, not knowing it's Cinder at the time, because she was under the impression Cinder was not a bad guy, but was just a fellow student. But she sees something that's up, and she goes and pursues Cinder of her own agency. She doesn't just fall into the plot. Here, yeah, like there is a whole thing, but like it's not the only thing that happens that's relevant to the plot. It's just pointing that out just for what it's worth, because he skipped over that a lot.
Knowing that it had a creative lead and 2 writers, and the plot consisted of a bunch of people fucking about, going to the prom, and not doing much else for most of the season? Like, seriously, what were you doing? It turns out there's an entire...
Also, character work is what was going on, by the way. Character work, Jean character work, a lot of Blake and Yang character work, yeah, there is character work going on, but if that's not, important to you, I guess, then yeah, nothing was going on.
A dead underground civilization the bad guy and his goons are doing an evil plan in, but the next fights that Monty was making were a series of fights on and in a train, riffing on the ideas he'd had during the Black trailer, and those scenes are supposed to happen now. So the dead, destroyed civilization that RWBY just fell into has a working rail network with a train in it. This is another instance of there's no point in fighting these things. Like, instead of the plot leading organically into the fights on the train is just there when it needs to be in the story. I feel like there might have been a slightly easier way of getting the characters onto it.
Wait, what? The train is, like, it's important to Roman's plan. He does this whole thing where there's a whole breach. Literally, I think it's either the second to last or the last episode of Volume 2 is called Breach, because they do a whole, like, disaster thing where I'm having a hard time remembering all the details, but I'm pretty sure they use the dust he collected, the dust Roman collected, and they put it on the train, and they blast the train through something into, like, a main city square, or something like that. Again, I'd have to look, it's been a long time since I've watched Volume 2, but, like, the train is not just coincidentally there and working. Like, it's important to what Roman is doing. It's a vital part of his plan.
Train. That's all I'm saying. But once we get there, the actual action sequences on the train are really well done. Monty and Shane and the rest of the team do some really stellar work here. The Zwei scene from yesterday was Shane Newville's idea. Blame him. Thank you, Shane. That scene was amazing. Oh, and thank you, Harley Dwartz, who Shane says helped. This is the second best shot in the entire show, ever, of all time.
Just want to say that um, this doesn't fit into like any of the world building or anything like that. This is just cool for its own sake, which Monty would do sometimes. He loved that. He loved just doing things that was cool. But if we're gonna talk about problems with like world building or anything like that, which he spent a lot of time on, go watch the previous stream. This doesn't make any sense. There was no setup. There's no anything. This doesn't make any sense. But it's awesome. But it doesn't make any sense. So, I don't know. I'm just pointing that out.
Do you get it? Do you get it? And I wish the writing and story had the kind of energy the animators were capable of manifesting. There is this one really cool fight between Yang and Neo, a character fans love because her deal is she doesn't talk and therefore cannot be ruined by the writers. She actually beats Yang, and then...
That's not why fans love her. God damn, that's such a dishonest way of framing it. You know? Like, Neo's actually a compelling, interesting character. Like, the fact that she is mute is part of what makes her compelling, but it's not because she has no dialogue. It's because she conveys so much with just her body. And, like, she's really, like, look at this here. Like, Neo is brutal, and she, of course, gets a lot more brutal later on for those who have seen up to the most recent stuff. But, like, I just want to point this out, I guess. Like, she's not a fan favorite because people... I mean, hell, for crying out loud, one of the most common things I've seen about Neo is, like, this thing of, like, oh, when is she finally going to be able to talk? Like, you know, like, that'll be some big emotional moment or something like that. Let's be clear here, just tangent. That's ableist. It's, like, plain and simple. Okay? Neo is mute. She does not have to ever stop being mute. She is mute, and that's fine. She conveys everything perfectly fine. She is mute. She's a mute person. That's fine, and she does not ever need to speak. And it's time for the RWBY fandom to stop that. So, just in case you guys think that I am purely criticizing hbomb here, no, I'm like it's important to be able to criticize anything that needs criticism. I'm not here to just criticize hbomb. I'm just talking about this in a wider context, and this just sparked that thing real quick, which is RWBY fandom. Stop speculating when Neo's going to talk. She is mute. Period. She is not going to talk, and that's fine. Okay? Now, going back to the video, I just want to say that, like, it is funny that, like, there is this whole ableist narrative of when is Neo finally going to talk, and it's actually pretty big in terms of when people talk about Neo, which is really unfortunate. And yet hbomb here says that people like Neo because she can't talk, so she can't be ruined by the writers. Like, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff in this video that suggests that hbomb just hasn't spent any real time in discussions about RWBY, or in the RWBY fandom in any meaningful capacity. Like, I've been in the RWBY fandom for a long time now, and you get used to a lot of the sort of conversations that go around. and you get familiar with them, and you try and learn to deal with them. Some of them are really bad. Some of them are not as bad. But, like, if you spend time in the fandom, you understand where things are being talked about. And in this video, hbomberguy has said a bunch of stuff about the fans that just doesn't hold up to the reality of being in the fandom. And I get that this is, like, a joke, right? But it has weight. Because, you know, again, especially to those who have not watched RWBY, this is conveying something to them. It is conveying something to them about the fans, about what fans want, and what fans actually like about RWBY, as well as continuing to spin the narrative that Miles and Carrie are just awful writers in every capacity, and that there is no value they bring really to RWBY whatsoever. Let's keep going.
A strange warrior woman we don't know at all turns up to protect her, and Neo is so fuck off scared of whoever this lady is that she's like, nope, peace out, and then the lady leaves. It's really cool and mysterious, but there is one teeny issue with this scene, and that's the really good music that plays during it. This is genuinely a pretty awesome track. It really builds tension and mystery for what's going on with this character and what her deal is. This track is also the best piece of music that Jeff Williams didn't make. Well, that's not fair to say, that's kind of mean. But when I first heard this song, I couldn't get it out of my head. And I realized that I couldn't because I'd heard it a bunch somewhere else before. And then I remembered that I spent most of 2014 listening to the soundtrack to the Godzilla movie that came out that year. They found the bones of the Godzilla soundtrack.
Wait.
They rebuilt him into MIDI that year.
I just want to pause and see exactly what he said on that screen. By the way, the shot where that song plays triggers Content ID, so I had to add those weird visuals so Rooster Teeth didn't block the video to protect their intellectual property, which is highly ironic, but I'm honestly too exhausted by having to make slight edits and re-upload the video 12 times to make a joke about it anymore.
They found the bones of the Godzilla soundtrack, and they rebuilt him into MIDI Godzilla. Now, I'm not saying this is plagiarism or anything. These songs are just incredibly similar because they're both very generic. But I do kind of secretly hope that they got the idea from the Godzilla movie, because I love finding other secret Godzilla fans out there. Oh, Shin Godzilla was so good, wasn't it? The train crashes into the city, so a bunch of Grimm attack people. All our main...
Right, because that was Roman's plan. Hence the train.
Characters work together to beat up some monsters for a while. Oh look, a reference to Haloid, which was itself a reference to The Matrix. I love it. It's a pretty good end to a volume, you know, defending a city from a bunch of monsters. And then Team Coffee shows up. Team Coffee, 4 characters who've barely been on screen until this exact moment and only get mentioned in passing like once, appear and heroically single-handedly kill almost all the Grimm in a matter of seconds. I absolutely love the music for this fight. It's awful. It's objectively a terrible song, but I love it. It's like if the Sonic Adventure...
Unless it was stolen, like there was a little thing that just said that there. Listen, you can't just make accusations like that, man. You gotta back it up. Now, I mean, you just said that, like, the whole Godzilla thing, you were saying that wasn't actually stolen, They just sound similar. So then you're going to add a little thing that says, unless it was stolen? I mean, it's not a funny joke, that's for sure.
Soundtracks vomited into my mouth, and I want it. This is the climactic action sequence of the volume, by the way. Monsters attack the city, and 4 other characters turn up and save the day. That's the story! Once again, a bunch of characters we barely know are starring in the climactic fight of a season of the show. Who the hell is this guy? What are his weapons? Why does he look like that? What is the point of having a story if this is how it ends every season? If I wanted context-free fighting, I'd watch Dead Fantasy again. The whole point of RWBY is that there were writers helping make it something more than that, connect the fights in an organic and meaningful way. RWBY could have just been a collection of fun fights uploaded on a YouTube channel, and all it would have lost is several hours of baggage.
You just destroyed my favorite clothing store.
I guess that's his opinion, you know? It just feels... really, like, just feels bad. just feels bad. I don't like that, what he just said. It's so cynical and dismissive. But it is just his opinion, so, you know, I'll let it stand.
Oh, you can barely tell a man wrote this. There's one particular strange moment in this scene that really encapsulates the problems the writing is having. Why do I write such long sentences? This character, the bunny girl who appeared very briefly in season 1, her name is Velvet. She has a weird case that's got her weapon hidden in it, and when she goes to use it in the fight, her leader, whose name I had to Google because I don't think we're told it until the next season, no, I'm not going to tell you what it is, says,
Hey, come on, you spent all semester building that up. Don't waste it here.
and proceeds to do all the killing herself with her cool minigun bag thing. It's great. This line is meant to be like a funny nod to the audience, right? Like, we've been building that up for ages, let's not waste it now. It's meant to be a funny joke, but the problem is that joke requires the setup of us having seen that Velvet has a weapon and wanting to find out what it is. But because the story's writing has been so...
It's not a joke. It sets up... That's the setup for a thing that happens in Volume 3. Now, in terms of Team Coffee coming in and doing all this, I think there's some legitimate criticism there. I think that's a bit legitimate. I do want to say that there is a clear effort in Volume 1 and 2 especially, but also Volume 3 a bit, to really show that Team RWBY and Team Juniper, with like the exception of Pyrrha, are all still learning. Like, they are not as good at being huntresses and huntsmen as people who have been doing this for a bit longer, like Team Coffee. So, like, I guess that's sort of what I would say is that, like, I would say that this probably was at least in part intended to continue showing how out of their depth Team RWBY is, and, like, how they're not qualified to be huntresses yet. However, again, I do think while I will say that Team Coffee has been developed more since, with a book of their own, two books that they starred in, and then they're going to be a pretty major player, looks like, in Volume 10, Greenlight Volume 10, and probably going forward after that. But at this point, when hbom released this video, I don't think any of those were out yet, and there is like a legitimate thing of like, these characters make a huge splash, and then they're really not like around they don't really have a lot of weight to the story. And to give them some big heroic moment in the finale of Volume 2, yeah, it's a little awkward. Gonna give that to hbomb here.
Mismanaged, Velvet has been on screen for literally seconds in the show so far. The clip of Velvet you're seeing right now, this is her only appearance in Volume 2. She just walked off screen, right? She's gone. That's it. See you in the climax. So all we get is this scene of the group leaving for a mission, and another character mentioning they sure have been away on that mission for a while.
Team Coffee's away mission lasted longer than expected.
We don't know who this character is. The joke about Velvet's weapon, combined with her and her team's sparse appearance in the show, despite saving the day at the end, is perhaps the clearest look into the early show's production problems. Was this scene planned in advance, and then the writers didn't have room to give Team Coffee a place in the story because there was already too many characters to handle and all the prom stuff? Did Monty and co suddenly drop the climactic fight on the rest of the creators at the last minute, and then they had to scramble to give it any sort of last minute justification? Did the creative leads all mutually agree that the best way to end a season of the show was for it to star a bunch of random new characters? I don't know, and it doesn't feel right to speculate, but I do know that the way things are means the story sucks. All the plot scenes of the show feel so weightless and contribute so little to the thing that really works, the fights, that the story ends up being basically an afterthought. I do have to say though, it does look like at some point in the production process, Team Coffee, or at least Velvet, were meant to play a larger role in the show, and there is evidence that suggests this. The behind-the-scenes production diaries for Volume 2 spend a lot of time specifically covering the creation and development of Velvet.
So we thought we would introduce you to the various parts of the production pipeline by following the supporting character of Velvet that we introduced in Volume 1, and follow her from concept to modeling and how she comes to life in the recording booth and in the animation and in the edit.
They sifted through hundreds of fan submissions.
Over 1,300 submissions.
We see the modelers and rigging and artists working on her and her weapons. We see the effort that goes into designing the case for her cool weapon, but we don't want to spoil what's in it.
So this is what her weapon's going to be in. We're not showing the weapon yet, because
Yeah, no.
you're not going to see that yet, but we need something for her to carry it in.
You know, as if to imply that at some point in the show we would see Velvet have a box with the weapon in it and people go, ooh, what's in it? And she'd be like, you'll see. We meet the voice actress, all of this stuff. Hours and hours of multiple artists putting time and attention into creating this character. And all of this work goes into the creation of a character who, due to some kind of natural disaster, is on screen for like 30 seconds maximum and does nothing. Just to give you a sense of how miserably mismanaged the writing was, Velvet is speaking for about 14 seconds of Volume 2 of RWBY. I just showed you all of it. The interview with the voice actress in the behind-the-scenes material is longer than that. I think Volume 2 might have needed a second draft. This fight is technically really cool looking, and I really enjoy the animation, especially this bit where the Grimm's legs flip out. But imagine how much better the scene would have felt if you knew who these characters were, or if this fight felt at all like part of a story. You know? It turns out that even compared to Machinima, making an animated series is like really hard. A whole ton of people have to work together as part of a huge process to get this thing made.
And RWBY is a higher level of production than any other show we've ever produced.
And if the process isn't being managed very well, or the big picture ideas aren't there, then the resulting show suffers massively. There are tons of scenes in the show that are fairly decent, especially the fights. But because of issues with putting the show together, the result is a show that's less than the sum of its parts, and what feels like 2 full seasons of teething problems. You know, there are lots of shows with like fun fights to watch, like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which
I would like to say that having 2 seasons of teething problems is actually really common. Like, that's not a RWBY thing. Like, most shows take at least 1 season to find their footing, if not 2. That's normal. There's still, like, the writers are still learning, they're adjusting to feedback, they're figuring out what works and what doesn't. That's normal. And again, right, like, Volume 1 and Volume 2 together are, like, less than 5 hours, right? They're each, like, Volume 1 is an hour and a half. I think that Volume 2 is like 2 hours or something. It's just... Yeah. Oof. Like, it's not a lot of time. They had a very small budget. They didn't have an animation department yet. And, like, all of that combined with the fact that, yeah, most shows, even with a budget and a full writer's room, like, most of them still have teething problems for at least one season, if not two. It's very rare that a first season is really everything that a show could be. Like, that it's all that potential. Oh, I forgot to, sorry. Just noticed I forgot to post that on Tumblr. Well, there we go. Okay, so just want to point that out.
Brought up earlier. But the thing about those shows is, even when I remember the really cool fights, I go back and watch entire episodes or arcs of the show again. I don't just go like, oh, I remember that fight's good, let's just watch that out of context. Like, no, the storytelling is part of what accentuates those scenes. Fights in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure feel meaningful because they've been built up to by the plot. Monty's fights are still some of the coolest fights, but they're never going to have the impact they could have done, because either due to a lack of planning of what the story would be, or very poor writing choices being made in connecting his action sequences, the story these fights should have been a part of is practically non-existent. And honestly, it just seems like such a waste, you know? So far we've mostly talked about the production and execution angle of RWBY, the telling of the story, the conveyance of the world, and how well the writers incorporated the action sequences. But now we need to dig one layer deeper and discuss the story they're trying to tell. Remember that first fight in the dust?
There's a quick little joke that he puts in there, which is like, it's like, underneath the story itself has critical flaws. It says, Rebecca Sugar killed my family, which is a joke I really don't like.
Angle of
hold on, let me make sure to have evidence of that.
The conveyance of the world, and how well the writers incorporated the action sequences. But now we need to dig one layer deeper and discuss the story they're trying to tell.
There you go. Rebecca Sugar killed my family. Right there. How? Why? What kind of joke, quote unquote, is that? It's just... Why? Especially because Rebecca Sugar is just another creator who's just been ruthlessly shit on by a lot of people engaging in bad faith. There's actually a lot of similarities between the videos Lily Orchard, the infamous Lily Orchard, has done on Steven Universe and this video from hbomberguy, and I'm sure I'll go into that further in the video essay that I'll eventually be doing on this. But I don't know, it's just, it bothers me a lot because it's not even there for long enough for anyone to laugh at. It's just kind of bad. It's just there for it to be bad.
Remember that first fight in the dust store? And how I talked about how it is kind of a good idea for an introductory scene? Because introducing your protagonist by having them stop a robbery is a good idea for an opening. In fact, it's a good intro in the movie they got this idea from. Oh, plot twist! Cowboy Cowboy Bebop is a great anime. It's a 26-episode series, and it also has a feature-length movie. In the movie, they reintroduce the main characters from the show by having there be a convenience store getting held up at gunpoint, and Spike, the main character, comes in with headphones on and shops around, pretending he can't tell what's going on, before expertly taking them all out with some backup from his friend. This is a really good opening scene. The problem with RWBY is that its writers didn't seem to know why it was a good opening. This opening works well in the movie because it takes the opportunity to tell us about our characters and how they think. Spike tells a guy holding an old woman hostage that he doesn't care if he shoots her.
Sorry, lady, but we don't protect or serve. This is strictly business.
What? Guess you'll just have to chalk it up to bad luck.
Which makes you think, oh, wow, maybe this guy has no real regard for human life. But then it turns out he did that to get the guy to turn his gun on him in order to save the lady's life. So really, he has no regard for his own life, and will gladly put himself in extra danger if it means it might help someone else. This scene is good because it's what we call characterization. We're learning about our main character and how he thinks. The action is well animated and nice looking, but that's secondary to the experience of learning about our characters. We're learning how little Spike values his own life.
If you keep on pushing it like this, you're really going to get cut down to size for good.
So, this is an issue that I think we're going to be talking a lot more about with what's coming up here, which is the assumption that homages are going to, like, any homages that RWBY does, inevitably are trying to do the exact same thing as what they are paying homage to. Like, that is an assumption being made, and it's definitely not necessarily true. However, I also want to say that, and he's about to go into this, but, like, that our introduction to RWBY actually does tell us about her. In particular, she gets involved, even when maybe she shouldn't. Like, she goes after a wanted criminal. Like, she doesn't just, like, she's what, 15 in this first episode, right? And not only does she beat up all the guys in the store, right? But she actively pursues the guy in charge. That does tell us something about her. You know, it doesn't tell us everything about her, but it tells us something for sure. But yeah, so let's keep watching. Also, I will also say that even with the evidence, and I put in heavy quotes, as you'll see, that this was an homage to Cowboy Bebop. And it very well could have been. There's no proof of it. And, like, the idea that, like, you start your action cartoon with someone robbing a shop and your hero stopping them, I feel like it's a stretch to say that's 100% an homage. It's a natural place to put your character in for a conflict. There's so many examples of just of a store being robbed and the hero being there, like, coincidentally to stop it. Like, that's not, I don't know. It's not necessarily an homage, is I guess what I'm saying.
Sorry, I'm not exactly the delicate, cautious type.
In the show, we have a lot of time to learn in detail that Spike...
Also, just want to say, and, you know, this is maybe a smaller thing, but, like, this guy actively saying out loud, I'm not exactly the delicate, cautious type, is about as subtle as Adam saying, Adam the character from the Black trailer saying, what about them, in terms of the passengers, right? Like, it's not subtle, and it's even a bit clunky for a character to just say to another character who knows them, sorry, I'm not the cautious, delicate type. Like, it's fine. I don't mind it. I'm just pointing out how there's a bit of a double standard here.
Mike has embraced a very specific philosophy toward his life.
Whatever happens, happens.
And he doesn't even really see himself as alive, and this enables him to more easily throw himself at life or death situations. How he got this way is part of the story. The movie sets up this part of his character incredibly quickly for people who didn't see the show, or refreshes people who need a reminder by showing how he saves a woman's life by making sure it's him being shot at instead. We're seeing a dimension of his character which the rest of the story is going to go on to explore. What does a man who doesn't value his own life do with his life, other than constantly risk it in ways he didn't have to? Is this a heroic trait, or is it a bit sad to constantly live this way? Welcome to the core themes of Cowboy Bebop. I mean, the movie's literally called Knocking on Heaven's Door. Like, the film's about these ideas. This robbery doesn't really have anything to do with the plot at all. It's an unrelated opening scene. But Cowboy Bebop's scene is better storytelling because it is telling you things, and you are learning something, and your brain is thinking about it. I want to know more about what Spike's deal is. I want to see what he does next. What does RWBY set up about Ruby in this first scene? Well, she's reading Weapon magazine and actually distracted instead of pretending, which I guess shows us that she likes weapons a lot, and she's still a child who doesn't pay much attention to her surroundings. We also see she's a really strong fighter. For example, without taking her weapon out, using her bare hands, she beats the shit out of two guys bigger than her and sends them flying. Remember this part, I'm gonna do a thing. This isn't really
I'm gonna get back to that when he goes into that, because he goes into that a lot. He really lays into that, and I have something I want to say about that.
In stories, even in intensive action sequences, are compelling largely because of how meaningful they are to the audience, and this is achieved by developing a connection with the characters. The gang in Bebop choose to get involved in this, and choose how specifically to handle everything that happens, and Spike even deliberately chooses to put himself in way more danger to try to help someone else. What these decisions are, and why they make them, are interesting. The story of this movie is what we call character-driven. In this opening scene, RWBY never actually has to make a choice. She just happens to be there, just happens to be a badass anime warrior who can beat these guys easily, and then just happens to be seen doing it by a professor at Anime Hogwarts.
So, she has to chase Roman, though. That's a decision she makes. And, it's important to note, she makes sure to check in with the shopkeeper before she goes. That also says something about her. She says, "Are you going to be okay?" or something along those lines. And he says, "Mm-hmm." And she chooses to go after Roman, despite the fact that he was running away. And Roman actively makes the observation that she is persistent. That she, she saw a bad guy. She saw someone who was hurting people, specifically, and decided to go after them, even though she wasn't really prepared to do so. She didn't have the ability at this point in the story to take down a crime boss. But she's just the kind of person who wanted to try anyway.
who refers her to the headmaster. RWBY gets into this school and is therefore present for the rest of the plot of the show because she happened to be in a store while it was being robbed. This isn't character-driven story writing. This is coincidence-driven story writing. Also, about this scene where RWBY is like being interrogated by Glinda and Gandalf Goku, they're like in this dimly lit chamber, like it's a prison or something, but then it turns out that she was brought here to be invited to a school.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
You want to come to my school?
Why is it shot and lit like an interrogation? Where are they? Is this like a safe house that this guy has? Okay, there actually is an explanation for why this scene is like this, and we're gonna get into it. Don't you worry, it's a doozy. So the issue with the dust store robbery is that RWBY doesn't actually choose to do anything. A fight happens at her, and she wins. To be honest, that's basically the entire plot of the show, except sometimes the fight happens at someone else we barely know. So the issue with this scene is lack of character.
I'm sorry, you can't have spent an hour and 25 minutes talking primarily about Volume 1 and Volume 2 and say that that's the entire show. That's not an argument you can make. It's not reasonable to make that argument. He's mentioned a few times stuff that happens later, but I mean, first of all, RWBY definitely has more agency in the story, as I've talked about, than he's giving her credit for, and then he's giving the writers credit for. But like, yeah, I just feel like it's absurd to claim that that's the whole show, especially when you haven't talked about most of the show. You have mainly focused on Volume 1 and Volume 2.
Characterization. And this isn't a failure of the writing of the specific scene, but a more general problem with the way the creative leads treat the characters. RWBY hasn't been made a particularly interesting person. She has a cool gun and is good at fighting and wants to be a hero, and that's about it.
Your book. Does it have a name?
It's about a man with two souls.
I love books.
I love books. Our main character, ladies and gentlemen, coming up with...
So I'll actually be developing a video essay sooner rather than later to talk about this in particular. But he conveniently leaves out everything RWBY says after I love books. Everything. So let's let him talk about this, and then I want to talk about what's actually going on here.
Compelling characters who make interesting decisions is basically the core job of stories. RWBY is effectively a blank slate, so she's just not interesting except when she's physically doing something interesting with her cool gun, like bouncing in the air using its blowback to slow her descent. That's interesting. For a couple of seconds. RWBY's so poorly characterized that the writers are still making up their minds multiple seasons in, to the point that even what little we do know about her gets rewritten to try to make her more interesting than she first appeared. For example, when RWBY falls into the plot, she doesn't have a weapon with her, but luckily, as we've seen, she's an expert at hand-to-hand combat and can easily dispatch the... Oh, wait.
Right, so here's what I was going to mention earlier. Again, Monty does the fights. Monty does those, right? So when RWBY throws those guys out the window, right? That's not a Miles and Carey decision. That's a Monty decision. Now, you could say, oh, Miles and Carey should have, should have taken that into account. Sure, maybe. But maybe Monty should have talked with his writers. And not done that. We know that he didn't always communicate with them properly. Yeah, I mean, also, the fact is that we never see RWBY good at hand-to-hand combat at any other point. We don't even actually see her good at hand-to-hand combat in that scene. We just see two guys being thrown out the window, and then her scythe unfolding. We don't actually know what she did, so the idea that she's a master in hand-to-hand combat is a stretch, I guess. I don't know. It just feels like, yeah, it's
Between these two scenes, the writers decided it would be more interesting for RWBY to be useless without her weapon.
Wow, you are much more manageable without that oversized gardening tool of yours.
So now we're in a situation where characters' basic abilities are being rewritten on a whim to try to make the story more interesting. And maybe it is more interesting, and all you have to do to engage with this new story is forget the events of the very first scene in the show. So what little characterization is happening in this scene gets rewritten later. This means even in potentially cool scenes taken directly from one of the best anime ever, the scene doesn't work because the character doesn't have an opportunity to act, to make choices. So yeah, I'm gonna say this scene doesn't work very well because it doesn't have any decently thought out characters in it, and therefore has nothing to tell or show us about them except for the basic aesthetic design of RWBY and her weapon and the coolness of the fight animations. So the writers evidently had seen the opening of Cowboy Bebop the movie, enjoyed it because it's great,
Nice.
and decided to start their show in a similar way, but didn't know why Cowboy Bebop's opening actually worked so well, so they just borrowed the surface components, store robbery, acting distracted, headphones, and cool fight, without using them in a way that does anything specific for the audience. Now, you could say, well, how do you know this is the scene that inspired them? What if the scenes just happen to be similar? Well, if that's the case, the scene still doesn't work, and the comparison still shows how much better the scene could have been if it was being used for actual characterization, but yeah, maybe the similarities are accidental. To prove they aren't, I'd have to somehow demonstrate the creators had seen Cowboy Bebop, and there's just no easy way
If
of
I'd recommend a show to someone looking to get into anime, I'd go with my personal favorite, Cowboy Bebop, because I think it's got enough like Western stuff going on. Just say Spike. I'm just gonna say Spike Spiegel from Cowboy Bebop because he's just like water and he's so cool.
My favorite is Cowboy Bebop. My favorite anime is Cowboy Bebop, and although it's not technically an anime, I also love Avatar: The Last Airbender. Avatar, Okay, so I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say maybe Miles was inspired by his favorite anime while trying to write an anime.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. But it's not a crime. And again, the scene was not going for the same things. I feel like if it was directly meant to be an homage, the fight itself would have more in common, wouldn't it? Also, he said that his friend, like in Cowboy Bebop, Spike's friend backed him up. RWBY was alone there. I don't know. It just feels like there's not. Yeah, it just feels very weak here. These arguments feel very weak. I guess we move past the whole Isle of Books thing, but basically, after she says that, she talks about why she wants to be a hero, and she talks about basically the themes of the entire show. This idea of like the world isn't a fairy tale, and like people don't really live happily ever after. And she says, well, that's why we're here, to make it better. And look, if you're going to call that, a cookie cutter, blank slate, whatever, fine. That can be your opinion. But I expect you to have the same criticism for Sonic the Hedgehog, for Captain America from the MCU, for any other characters that are just kind of good people. Also, this is my personal opinion, I don't think it's bad for a character to just be a good person. To just be kind. To just be a decent person who wants to do good. I think that that's perfectly fine. And what's interesting about RWBY is not just that she wants to be a hero, it's that she knows it's that she tries to be pure, and she tries to be a storybook hero in a world that is not built for simple stories. So she ends up putting everything on her own shoulders, and it really weighs on her, and it comes to a head in Volume 9, where, you know, so, like, just want to point this out. Now, obviously, Volume 9 hadn't come out yet. I think he said they were coming up on Volume 8, when he released this. But I do want to say that, like, that story of RWBY really dealing with the weight of everything was absolutely in full swing by the end of Volume 7. So I don't know, like, it's the contrast between RWBY's pure goodness and the world around her that makes her interesting, and, you know, and her ability or lack thereof to maintain that pure heart and that pure goodness. So, you know, I don't know. Anyways, there's going to be an actual video essay about what that scene tells us about both RWBY, both the character and the show, coming out next month or so. Or I guess in July, maybe. You know, we'll see. I think I have a specific thing that's planned, but I forget what date it is exactly.
You know what? I keep falling back to Bebop, but you shouldn't just run away from your past. Sometimes you just gotta deal with the problems that you started, and if you don't, they will catch up with you.
Keep in mind, I'm not saying this is plagiarism. Creative theft is a different thing entirely. I'm saying this is derivative and doesn't even replicate the thing it's trying to. It's certainly not wrong to draw inspiration from other works you like, or even pay deliberate homage to things you enjoy or which seem fitting to reference in a scene. I mean, Cowboy Bebop does this all the time, and the convenience store scene actually references Pulp Fiction, when one of the robbers they don't know about comes out of the bathroom and surprises them, which happens literally 3 times in Pulp Fiction.
I'm gonna take a shit.
Pretty sure this is a reference, and I should know, I had a lot of very long arguments on now deleted fan forums about whether this counts. And let me just say to Mazin Kaiser X, if you're still out there, I have a YouTube channel now, so fuck you, you little Philistine. I win. What I'm getting at here is that firstly, I've always been cool, but also that there's nothing wrong with wearing your inspiration on your sleeve. What is wrong is doing it without understanding what made the original thing work. Because now it's not a cool introduction to a character, story, and setting inspired by another good thing. It's a weird, clunky, and unnecessary scene whose best feature is it reminds people of Cowboy Bebop. But RWBY doesn't just remind me of Bebop, it reminds me of a lot of other anime, and this is a result of the show's design.
And then the next day he was like, hey, we should make an anime.
So, as prep before writing the show, Monty gave the writers some homework. Anime homework.
I went to Kerry and I gave him anime homework. If you want to be honest, you should do some anime homework. So I just started giving him shows to watch that we could, you know, work comparatively to. And then Miles was the second person onto this, where I would give him anime homework.
Yeah.
Watch this show if you want to be part of it.
Now, I don't like admitting this, I'm kind of secretive about it, but I've seen a lot of anime in my time, and I know a bit about it. I'd like to think no one's noticed this about me, but we've somehow finally reached a place where proper criticism of a piece of media relies on using that knowledge, a concept which terrifies me. But with the benefit of your trust, we'll come out the other side having learned more and improved our analytical technique. So, in the name of science, let's punch this plate of spaghetti in order to reverse engineer it to its component ingredients and find out what's really going on. It's a reference, but I'm also making a clever metaphor for analysis. RWBY is inspired by anime, not just in terms of visuals, but more directly by the tropes and idioms and basic story elements of shows the creators liked, or at least were told to watch. The problem is it draws far too much on ideas and concepts that feel like anime without really understanding what made the things it's borrowing actually work in the shows they were in. RWBY is a really strange bunch of shows, and if you're willing to check, you can even find out which ones. In a Reddit thread, Miles Luna said what some of the shows on his anime homework list were. Among them, Gurren Lagann, Soul Eater, Naruto, Bleach, and Black Rock Shooter. Some of these shows have direct parallels with RWBY's story. Naruto, Bleach, and Soul Eater especially have some direct contrasts. All these shows have large casts of characters who all, for their specific story reasons, have their own unique powers. This is really traditional for shonen shows. Everyone kind of has their own deal, and in Bleach, almost every main character has a unique magical sword which grants them a specific ability. And the main character in Soul Eater wields a cool scythe. It's not that hard to tell what ideas RWBY is borrowing from these shows, is it? But again, the core elements being borrowed are the really basic Wikipedia-level synopsis ideas. The sort of stuff people who don't watch anime think anime is about, like the school for learning anime fighting, the large cast of characters with cool abilities and powers, the super simple stuff that isn't really why anyone watches something. These shows work because they're really about the characters and their choices and relationships, and they happen to be set against a fun, fantastical background with cool action. Boruto's dad and his army of frenemies live rich inner lives and form interesting connections with each other and the audience as they grow and change. In Soul Eater, the cool weapons are alive, and lots of focus is put on how they relate to and work with their users. And this also happens in Bleach, but you know, in a way where it seems really awesome and you choose to watch it over all the other shonen at the time, and then it crushes your hopes and dreams. And it seems like, in the early RWBY-Weiss relationship, this is what they were going for. The way they bicker in the early trial, and Weiss is angry about not being the leader later. This is honestly, genuinely, the beginning of an interesting relationship. But instead of making this an aspect of the show, they fix it and make someone else's life the focus of the show for half of it, and then someone else turns up to do all the fighting. So the thing that makes these shows work, the characters, their relationships, your engagement with the characters as they do fun fights, is absent. It's a stew, but without the most important ingredient. The stew mix. That's the rule, by the way. You're allowed to make food metaphors in criticism, but only when they're actually a clever reference. At best, the main character, who theoretically should be the most interesting, is a lady in a nice outfit with a cool gun. That's a really low ceiling to put on a story. RWBY feels like fanfiction of a show that doesn't exist. Except no, that's not true. There is one specific show it feels a whole lot like fanfiction for. To quote Miles Luna again, if you want to get a feel of what the show will be like, watch Avatar: The Last Airbender. Oh, this explains a lot of things. So if you go watch Avatar, you start to realize where a lot of the show came from. For example, Avatar is set in a world with 4 nations in it.
Long ago, the 4 nations lived together in harmony.
RWBY has 4 kingdoms.
Yeah! Wow. They must have taken that from Avatar. I mean, it's not like 4 is just a solid number of things to have in your world. It's not like it's just a good number that hits right, or something that people could just come up with. Because it's like, hey, how many things should we have in our story? 4. Okay. It could be that simple. How do you go for... that's such a weak argument. It's absurd how weak that argument is.
So you see, it's different.
The 4 kingdoms.
They're called kingdoms because, well, they can't call them nations, can they? In Avatar, in times of stress, the Avatar enters a state where his eyes glow and he manifests amazing powers. You'll never guess that 3 seasons into the story, with zero setup that this is a thing, RWBY's eyes suddenly glow, and she's revealed to have the amazing power to instantly turn even the most powerful Grimm to stone. You learn she has this power the instant it happens, and you only learn what this power is in retrospect, because there was no room in the story to set this up, was there?
God, I'm hating how he keeps focusing on this idea that they're self-inserts. He keeps hammering that in. Whatever. Anyways, RWBY's silver eyes are nothing like the Avatar state, like at all. Like even just what you just saw, the visuals are so different. They're so different. even just the visuals. But we can even talk about, like, just the actual, what the Avatar state is compared to the actual Silver Eyes. The Avatar state is the Avatar connecting with all of their past lives, and using all of that experience. Ruby's Silver Eyes are connected to the gods that created Remnant. The two brothers, which is, it's a lore drop that comes down the line. And that's fine, because ultimately the Silver Eyes are, like, we're supposed to be surprised at them. RWBY is surprised at them. Because, again, there is this whole thing about adults and authority figures keeping secrets. It's a huge part of the show. Anyways, just another very flimsy comparison that he's acting like is incredibly strong.
Another cool thing about Avatar is that the Avatar reincarnates into a new form whenever he dies. Completely coincidentally, there's a character in RWBY whose spirit goes on to inhabit a new form whenever...
Okay, because, yeah, obviously Avatar created the idea of reincarnation. And of course, there's, the fact that reincarnation in RWBY is not a good thing, actually. What happens with Oz is he reincarnates into the body of an already living person who has a similar soul, and then he slowly merges with them and overtakes their identity. It's a tragedy. It's not a good thing. And you have this kid, Oscar, who's desperately trying to hold on to his own identity as Ozpin overtakes him and merges with him slowly. Anyone want to explain to me how that's like Avatar's Avatar cycle? Because I don't see it. Except for the fact that, I guess, reincarnation is a thing. But that doesn't feel like something that Avatar came up with.
he dies. Amazing. You see, it's actually a clever twist, because no one would have expected them to be that obvious. So when they really did just do Avatar again, it's a genuine surprise. Oh, another massively important plot element. One of the antagonists is a revolutionary political movement reacting to oppression, led by a man in a mask with horrendous scars underneath. Was I talking about RWBY there? No, I was talking about Avatar: Legend of Korra. But yes, that also happens in RWBY. Oh, actually, you see, the scar is different because it's over one of his eyes. That's slightly different from Avatar, so it's not the same thing, you see. No, what's this picture of Zuko doing?
So, Amon, his scar is paint. It's paint because he pretends to be someone he is not so that he can lead the revolution. He can radicalize everyone by appealing to their dissatisfaction. Now, there's a lot of issues with the way Amon was handled, and there's some issues with how the White Fang was handled and how the Faunus have been handled. They've been getting better, though. The politics of RWBY have been getting a lot better. At least they are, depending on who you ask. But certainly in my opinion. But I just, like, this guy, this is Adam, right? He is, first of all, he is genuinely scarred. Like, not just scarred, he's branded. That is a brand from the Schnee Dust Corporation. So, yeah, that's the first thing. But also, he's an abusive ex. That's like his whole thing. He's abusive and controlling, and he likes power. And unlike Amon, who, like, his him being a fraud is very much a twist. We know who Adam is up front. We know he's a bad guy, and so Blake has this whole arc of learning how to disconnect herself from him and to be able to stand up to him without really feeling like a victim, and to really just remove his power over her. And part of that journey for her is taking away the White Fang from him, like taking it away from him. And it's not perfectly executed, but she takes the White Fang away from him. She unites the Faunus. So, you know, just, yeah, it's not the same at all. Also, just, how can you go to a thing of like, oh, he's exactly like this character, oh, but then actually if you just put this other character, the aesthetics match, like, I don't know, it's again, this all just feels so weak. There's such weak arguments, which is really annoying for someone as skilled at video essays as hbomberguy. It's all such weak arguments.
Here. Then, in later seasons, they decide to take the story in a very different direction, you know, to make it a bit more unique. So now the characters have to travel the world and visit lots of different towns and villages and cultures on their way, which is completely unlike Avatar, because when it happens in Avatar, it's good. Remember when I was positive about the potential of RWBY's story and setting? Well, it feels like I'm really just complimenting the material it borrowed. So many of RWBY's choices seem made specifically that way because it was that way in Avatar.
I just do want to say, again, is it really an Avatar The Last Airbender exclusive of having your characters just travel across your world? Doesn't feel like it to me. Like, why is that? Isn't that just a...
I know it's completely unnecessary to borrow those parts.
Why is it that every time you play with magic water, I get soaked?
It's not magic, it's water bending.
Oh my god, is that where the character's powers not being magic came from? Why would you even think to do that? I always thought each season of RWBY being called a volume was a bit weird and unwieldy. And guess what? It turns out it sounds way better when they're called books. Even the intro voice...
They're called volumes because RWBY is a story about stories. Like, there's a whole metatextual thing about really being a reflection on the nature of stories. So, volume as in... It's a volume one of a story. Now, you could say that it's similar to book one, that kind of thing. But, you know, I would also say that it in terms of just, like, whether it's actually copying it, not really, because it doesn't even copy the format of, like, you know, it's like book one air, right? Book two water, etc. Like, RWBY just says volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. It also is not that unwieldy. I guess, you know, if he feels it's unwieldy, that's his prerogative. But, I don't know. Again, this just feels like such a weak argument. Like, why... Yeah. He's acting like all of this together makes a stronger argument. That, like, maybe some of this was weak on its own, but together, like, there's no way that it wasn't. But... I don't know, it just feels so weak, man. The whole argument feels so weak, and he goes on for a long time about this. Let's keep going.
Voiceover sometimes sounds like they right-click thesaurused some aspects of Avatar's intro.
My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old days.
Legends. Stories scattered through time.
It's like the show's playing a game of telephone with Avatar. Those words in that order sounded good, so let's use some words that are a bit similar in a different order, and also make it all about dust. The thing that made Avatar's introduction work is it set up a lot of stuff at once. For example, how this setting's version of magic worked, the thing you didn't mention at all, or the fact there were 4 big nations. You know, the thing you didn't mention at all, except for when 4 castle-looking things turn up for 3 seconds before disappearing. Jean is a pretty direct analogue for soccer, to the point where the creators just say that's what he's based on.
Oh no, I'm saying like we when you first did Reed, and I was like, we need like a soccer character.
And this retroactively explains why Jean's plotline was so weird. The Jean arc had this subplot of Jean not accepting Pyrrha's offer to help train him to be a better fighter, but his explanation for why was always really strange. He wants to get better without help, or he's not really a hero, or something.
If I can't do this on my own, then what good am I?
But he never tries, and never pays attention in class, so that's bullshit. And at the end of his section of the story, he just accepts her help. Standing up to a bully taught him to... This confusing arc happens because it happened to Sokka. In Avatar, a story with characters with depth and infinitely better world building, in the beginning Sokka is not a great warrior, but he desperately wants to be one. He's from a culture that looks down on the idea of women being fighters, but then he gets wrecked by an order of female warriors who protect a village on their travels and has to confront his beliefs about women. He learns a lesson from this and begs them to train him. He gets better as a fighter, but this plotline is super engaging for an audience because we get to watch him grow as a person and change his beliefs. Sokka starts out like kind of as a shitty teen. I thought I would really not like him when I first watched Avatar, but he grows so much. He becomes such an interesting character super quickly. So now it's clear why Jean's arc is seemingly missing pieces. It's not just that Sokka was written better, but more specifically, it's clear the writers liked the idea of giving their Sokka character the same arc, but the problem with this arc is it means one of your core characters starts out as a bit of a chauvinist and needs time and work to grow into a better person. But if you're trying to write a cool progressive anime starring mostly girls, you don't want to have a character acting like that, do you? That sounds kind of heavy. And are you really going to write your character who you voice to act like that? So Jean is written to already start out as basically a good person who respects women's abilities as fighters, who simply needs to learn to accept help instead of refusing it for what...
So, let's see. There's a few things here, right? So, Jean is a bit of a loser. In the beginning, and yeah. Him not putting in the effort is important. Let's see. So, okay, TWN037. If the writers say that they liked Avatar, and you can find multiple parallels between them, then that makes it a pretty strong case that they borrowed plot devices and characters without much forethought. So, let's see. 4 Kingdoms, intro that has narration and sets some stuff up. A character that deals with internalized toxic ideas of masculinity and has to grow. Okay, Jean has some stuff in similarity with Sokka. Alright. That's cool. Let's see. There was the reincarnation thing, right, which works completely differently in RWBY than it does in Avatar: The Last Airbender. So, how is it a ripoff? Like, there's one thing here that seems to be genuinely inspired by Avatar, which is Jean. And it's the only one that there's any actual evidence given for from the actual people who wrote the show. Like, I would agree with you, except that the things that are being pointed out as parallels are just story elements. not arguing it's a ripoff of Avatar, just that the story isn't hitting the same heights as Avatar, despite taking clear inspiration. Okay. Let's keep watching. Because he does call it a ripoff, I believe, or something along those lines. What he does say is he calls it an Avatar remake. And earlier on, he called it Avatar fanfiction. So, you know, it's maybe not ripoff. I don't know if he uses those words specifically, but it's certainly the implication here.
'Tis now no reason. It actually turns out that a ton of weird things about RWBY happened that way because they were like that in Avatar. That interrogation thing in the first episode of RWBY was always a silly choice. Why take her to this weird dimly lit empty room to invite her to a school? But it makes much more sense if you happen to have seen the first episode of Legend of Korra, when Korra gets arrested and interrogated. If a scene in RWBY seems out of place, or like a scene from another show just happened for no reason in the middle of this one, it's probably because it did. So it's pretty clear, to the point they literally admit it, that a big problem with RWBY's writing is that the creators are grasping wildly at shows they like for things to recreate in their show in the hopes of crafting a story. It's only technically been written in one sense of the word. It's more of a reconstituted amalgam of things they thought were cool elsewhere. Grind up all that meat and stuff it into a sausage casing, or I guess in this case a body pillow. No, Miles, what are you doing? This is really embarrassing.
Ruby Rose is a 15-year-old girl.
If you like anything about RWBY, and you haven't seen much anime before because it didn't seem like it was for you, I guarantee you right now, there's a show in this list that the thing you liked about RWBY came from, and you'd like that show a hell of a lot more. And let's be honest, it's probably Avatar. A lot of people I've met who are really big fans of RWBY tend to be not into anime, they don't think it's for them, or they haven't watched it before yet. But if you take the plunge, and then you see how good a show using these ideas could be, you'll very quickly be able to see why a lot of people with a bit more of a frame of reference are so disappointed with this show. Go pick a show from that list and have a better time, seriously. Just make sure it's not Bleach.
I know several RWBY fans who are huge fans of anime, much bigger fans of anime than I am, who all love RWBY. His style of humor is pretty over-exaggerated like that. I haven't seen the video, but that's what I gathered over the past 20 minutes or so. Yeah, it is. His whole thing is very over-exaggerated. And that's fine when you're not trying to make detailed arguments for something. Like, if you're really trying to make good arguments, you can't just exaggerate your points. You have to make very specific, intentional points. So calling it, you know, accusing it of being an Avatar remake, it might be exaggeration, but if that's what you say, it's the point you're making. Like, you can't just say, oh, I'm just exaggerating everything, so you shouldn't take my argument seriously. Like, the words he chooses mean something, and he can't just pretend they don't, just because his persona is exaggerated. And, you know, what I'm really looking at on this stream is, what is he saying, whether or not he means to? Like, I'm really trying to understand that, like, pedo baiting of Miles Luna was uncalled for hbomberguy. Wasn't the Ruby Rose pillow someone fan made sent? I'm not sure. I don't know. That's worth looking into. But he's definitely, like, he's had several times, hbom has had several times where he has been trying to frame Miles and Carrie's as really problematic. Like, as people who are very pervy, and that we should be uncomfortable with. At the very least, that's how it's come across. Like, all his arguments about Jean and Neptune being self-inserts, Jean in particular, are all just really, really bad faith. At least that's how it comes across. Maybe he's doing it in good faith, but man, it comes across really bad. It comes across really bad. Like, that's not... These aren't things you should say as a joke. You know? The whole video really feels like it's really trying to make Miles and Carrie look as bad as possible. And it's very uncomfortable. And, like, maybe it's not the intention. I would love if hbomberguy came out and he reached out to me and he said, listen, here's actually what I was trying to say with this video. That would be great. I would love to have an actual conversation with hbomberguy about what he really meant with this video, rather than just, you know, talking about how it negatively impacted discussions around RWBY and how it, you know, it legitimized some very toxic conversations. Is he like... Yeah, he's presenting like Miles is doing all of it without the oversight. Well, he's what he's really doing is he's very much framing Miles and Carrie as like very much separate from Monty. Like, as if Monty didn't have a say over any of the writing they did, even though he admitted that they wrote, like, the outlines together. They developed the story together, but then he basically makes this argument that Monty does these fight scenes, and then Miles and Carrie try to create, like, scenes that connect the fight scenes to each other. And that's just, like... Ugh. Like, that's such a... Like, they were a team. Yeah, they had different expertises, different things they worked on. There was a division of labor, but they worked together. So the idea that Miles and Carrie's were, like, doing all this stuff, and Monty had no part in any of it, and Monty was this like, saint that had no part in any of the bad decisions, or, you know, that H-Bomb feels are bad decisions, feels really disingenuous. He did roughly the same line with Stephen Moffat in the Sherlock video. Yeah, I remember I watched that for research. And yeah, he made sure to pin everything on Stephen Moffat rather than anything on Mark Gatiss, who is a co-showrunner on Sherlock. I'm not saying Stephen Moffat doesn't have issues, and I'm not saying RWBY doesn't have issues, but it feels disingenuous. There is omitting of context that feels disingenuous. The Sherlock video actually had a lot of similar issues to this one, but this one kicks it up about several notches. Maybe more.
Don't make the same mistake I did. Please, you mustn't, you have to! There's a scene in Volume 2 where it turns out Yang and RWBY have a family dog called Zwei. There's a dog in Cowboy Bebop of the same breed called Ein. Get it? The creators are trying to make a cute reference to a show they like. They don't seem to have realized they've referenced all the shows they like quite enough already. I was hoping they'd eventually try doing something else. The real impact of all this on RWBY's potential is that it means the things that are truly unique about it get ignored. Because the world building is vague and really just a loose approximation of 9 other cartoons, all kinds of little tidbits crop up that would be so interesting if they went anywhere, but never will. Remember Crescent Rose? You know, one of the most dangerous weapons ever designed?
One of the most dangerous weapons ever designed?
There is one really interesting story element to it, which is that RWBY designed it.
Well, I'm kind of a dork when it comes to weapons. I guess I did go a little overboard in designing it.
RWBY designed this weapon.
One of the most dangerous weapons ever designed.
Now...
I'd just like to point out that the line after she says that, after Ruby says that she designed Crescent Rose, is that all students at Signal Academy, where she attends, make their own weapons. All of them.
If you were looking at the script and you'd written these two things, what you should do at that moment is kiss yourself and realize that you've just struck fucking gold. The main character of your show is a child inventor who can craft incredible machines that kill. What a fantastic premise for a story. And Ruby loves to read weapon magazines and nerds out about the weapons she sees when she first gets to Anime Warrior School. Like, they've almost written a character here. And everything else about Ruby's character...
I do just want to say, the part about her being a weapons nerd has been, like, it's still there, but it's not really as much of a character trait as they made it out to be early on, and, like, that's a fair criticism. I'm really trying to find the points where I do feel like it's a fair criticism. Like, even if I don't love the way he handles it in this video, I'm really trying to find those points and say, like, this is fair. This is actually okay. This makes sense. It doesn't... Like, there's something here that makes sense as something to criticize. I don't just want to watch this whole thing and be shitting on it, because I do believe that hbomberguy is a decent person, and I frankly do not understand why he made this video as he did, because it's just so bad. It's so bad in so many ways. It omits so much context. And anyways, I'm really trying to give him the benefit of the doubt to the best of my ability, and just, like, talk about how these things are framed and how it comes across and the messages it sends, rather than trying to accuse him of anything, if that makes sense. Yeah, I hope I'm doing an okay job, but there's a lot I don't like about this video. A lot that comes off real bad.
There's the most milquetoast stuff possible, like, oh, she wants to be a hero? Great.
I love books.
I think this line annoys me so much because, like, Ruby has a really interesting character trait you could be doing something with.
Was dangerous design.
And you're doing this? No, you can't, I forbid it! And when this comes up, Ruby's talking to Jean, whose deal is he just has a regular sword. Like, it's a punchline. And when I was first watching the show, I was really having my doubts about where things were going. But when this happened, I thought, oh, cool. Ruby's going to help him design a unique weapon that really works for him. And we're going to see them coming up with it and building it and developing as friends, and that's going to be so cool. Jean's going to come into his own and learn things about himself as he does it and grow as a fighter and as a person. And there's something really wholesome about learning a skill and building something in a story. That'll be a really cool thing to follow. And then it didn't happen for a season because they were doing anime bullshit instead, fighting monsters, dealing with bullies, falling asleep during pointless exposition. Oh, and in the show as well. And then, for years, I kept thinking, when are they going to do it? When are they going to do it? When are they going to use Ruby's interesting character trait that they just seemingly forgot she has? And then, finally, in Volume 4, they go to a blacksmith, and a character who we've never seen before and never will again upgrades Jean's sword using pieces of his girlfriend's armor. And Ruby rarely, if ever, talks about the fact she made Crescent Rose, and she stops nerding out about weapons except for, like, once per season.
Yeah, like, again, that's not as big a part of Ruby Rose as it sort of was made out to be. From what I've seen so far, I'm not surprised that Hypathon made his Monty's Vision video trilogy a few months after this H-Bomb video, which has more vibes than receipts. Yeah, I agree. Let's see. Rookie mistake, never assume a YouTuber is a good person, /J. Yeah, I mean, look. I try to assume everyone's a good person until they prove otherwise. I try to extend people grace, and H-Bomb has done a lot of good things, so I certainly don't have proof he's a bad person. So I don't feel comfortable making any claims along those lines. and I know you're joking, but like I feel like it's important to be upfront about that. There's a lot of people in the RWBY fandom who are very willing to buy into the narrative that hbomb is just an awful person. And I just don't think it's that clean cut. I think he made a very bad video that has done a lot of harm to the RWBY community. I think it framed some really decent people who are putting their passion and soul into this show in a very disingenuous light. I think it's probably a bit insulting to Monty's memory. But he's also done good stuff. You know, he's done important stuff. He's you know, his whole thing that he just did with uncovering the plagiarism, that was really important. And like he did that stream with, I think, like AOC ended up being on it, where he raised tons of money for trans people, I think. Like, you know, he's let's see. It's pretty bad faith on hbomb's part to try to frame only Miles and Carrie as being pervy, but not Monty, given that Monty's body of work is basically sexy superpowered girls fighting each other. Yeah, a bit. Let's see. So you're saying it's exactly the same situation as Donkey's Xenoblade 2 video. I don't know anything about that, so I'm not going to speak on that. By the way, for those of you who are all here, first of all, welcome. Great to have you all here. Thank you all for coming. I just want to say that. I want to make sure I say that. And I want to remind everyone that the full stream, if you want to watch the full thing, will be up on my Patreon. If you want to watch it all, and alongside part 1. Hypathlon's Monty videos came out about a year before hbomberguy's RWBY video. Okay, then I will have to fact check both of you, because now I don't know. I probably shouldn't have bought into it at face value anyway. I have seen those Monty videos, though, and they are fantastic. You know, Monty was not a perfect man, but he definitely was someone worth looking up to and worth learning from, you know? But he's no saint. He's not perfect, and there are a lot of issues with early RWBY that just come from him wanting to do things that were cool. He loved the rule of cool, and it made some things harder. You know, put in some world building that maybe wasn't actually going to be super useful, or something like that. It's, you know, there's stuff that came up that were problems, and they came from Monty. hbomb has even talked about it a bit. So, you know, like, I just want to be upfront, you know? But thank you, Faboover. I will still probably fact check it on my own, but yeah. Either way, I think it is good to do a comparison, sort of, between those Monty videos from Hypathion and this one from hbomb, because this one really is, I think, as was just said, more vibes than receipts. Let's keep going. But anyways, yeah, full thing will be on my Patreon for those, alongside part 1, if you want to hear everything I did for the first half or so of this video, which I did a couple days ago. I hope that you guys will give that. There will be more clips I upload, but I hope you check out the full thing, because it's not fun. It's not like fun to do this. It's interesting, but it's not fun. So I would just love it if people actually like went to see the full thing, because it's exhausting to do this. I don't like it.
The writers remember that was her one unique character trait. But I'm sure you're going somewhere with this Avatar remake. Don't let me distract you. No, I'm not even fucking kidding you. Even the forging of a sword out of some cool material he has is a thing Sokka does in Avatar. It just doesn't stop. It never stops.
See, like, that's such a weak thing. Like, what do you mean some cool material? Sokka's sword was forged out of a meteor, and Jean's sword was upgraded with the metal from Pyrrha's armor as a way to remember her. You can't just, like, boil that down to, oh, it's the same because they both use some kind of interesting metal to make their sword thing. Like, it's just such a... One of the most irritating things with M&K haters is how they try to use an us versus them thing in regards to Monty and M&K, where the former is a deity and the latter are degenerates. When in reality, Monty and M&K were pretty alike. They were partners. They were partners and co-creators. Is that what that's saying? Yeah, co-creators, not master and wayward disciples. Agreed. They were a team. And there's definitely a lot of narrative spun that they were not. And the thing that is so frustrating about this video in particular is that it really tries to present itself, and maybe genuinely so, but it doesn't come across this way, as a good faith exploration of what happened with RWBY and why it is the show that it is. Rather than just like it's not a video that presents itself as, you know, as Miles and Carrie were awful and Monty was great. Like, you know, it's no Hero Hey or anything like that. Like, it's not that kind of thing. It presents itself as a reasonable deep dive into RWBY as a show. And that's part of what's so frustrating and why it's so worth talking about. Because it can have and has had such an impact on the usual people's viewing of the show. Like, just the average person. Just the average person, not someone who's gonna get sucked into, you know, a right-wing rabbit hole about how, you know, and like worshipping, you know, like the abusive ex and the fascist dictator, you know, but just like a video that just kind of pushes people in a certain direction, that leaves them vulnerable to some really toxic ideas about what the show is and what the creators are like. And again, I don't want to accuse him of doing that intentionally, but it's definitely what this video is. Whether or not it was intentional.
This show has so many cool concepts that just crop up like that, where if you're paying attention, there's tremendous potential being laid down here. And then they ignore it to just loosely copy stuff from fucking Bleach. Look, that guy has the sword that's a bit like the one from Bleach. Do you remember Bleach? I remember Bleach. Someone please validate me remembering so much Bleach.
So again, like, oh, this guy has a big sword. Like, is that really a Bleach reference? It could be. But it's also just a big guy with a big sword.
Roger Ebert quote I always really liked, and used in a draft of this video I was working on like 5 years ago, which Lindsay Ellis happened to use first in a video before me, so now it feels like I'm ripping her off. Thanks, Lindsay. Where, when reviewing Battlefield Earth, he makes the comment that the director has learned from better films that directors sometimes tilt their cameras, but he has not learned why.
I'm gonna take a shit.
I believe Miles when he tells me Avatar is one of his favourite shows, but I'm not convinced he knows why he liked it. Cowboy Bebop is cool because it's about a man who believes his life is already over, throwing himself into life or death situations to feel alive again. Spike Spiegel carries a weight with him, and you have to watch him do his best to pretend he isn't. Cowboy Bebop is not cool because he's good at spinny kicks and his friend has a robot arm, and
just want to say, like, if you watch the rest of the show, which he says he has, right? Giant great swords are not unique to Bleach. See Berserk, FF7, and many more. Yep. Okay, wow, you're right. It is such a black hole moment to learn right now that HBOM had a treasure trove of actually good, well-sourced info about RWBY, and he just ignored it in his research. Yeah, in terms of the Monty videos, at least, yeah. And if they came out earlier, you just fact-check, yeah. Yeah, it's really bad research. This whole video is really bad research. Like I said this earlier, I don't think most of you were here yet, but, like, there's this... He says things about RWBY fans several times throughout this video that just, like, indicate to me that he has spent no real time in the RWBY fandom, like, learning about what the actual feelings about the show are. The one he said that I talked a bunch about earlier on was that, like, the reason that fans love Neo is because, like, she can't speak, so the writers can't ruin her. Which, A, is just a shitty thing to say. But B, like, it ignores that there's a whole problem actually in the RWBY fandom around ableism and the idea that, like, Neo will eventually talk. And, like, that's something we should be, like, pushing towards and rooting for and stuff like that. And, like, that's not... She's mute. She's mute, and that's okay, and that's fine. But, like, that's actually a big issue, and if he was in the RWBY fandom, he would know that people are actually pushing for her to talk, and it's an actual issue, rather than that people love Neo because she can't talk, and so Miles and Carrie don't put words in her mouth. You know, it's just this feeling of, like, you haven't really talked to RWBY fans. You haven't been in our community. You haven't talked to us. You don't know how we feel, and you're still trying to present yourself as if you are part of this and that you know sort of the general feelings around RWBY. It just... and again, maybe I'm wrong, but it feels that way.
Frankly, the idea that that's what really mattered is personally offensive to me. If you really respect this material, you should borrow the things that gave it meaning, not all of this surface-level stuff. This is kind of the important thing to drill in on here. These shows aren't about cool powers or great visuals or
and neither is
engaging
RWBY.
fights. They have those, but on a core level, what they're really about is characters. People who you feel things for, who you watch do things, who you can be invested in. If you don't have that base layer of engagement with the people in your story, you don't really have much of anything. If you have a cool fight, but you haven't made people interested in or understand why they're fighting, then you don't even really have the fight, do you? Lots of things in the show are references to other Rooster Teeth properties. There's in-jokes everywhere, posters from other shows, quotes from their podcasts. This store's name is a pun on A Simple Walk into Mordor, that show they did about walking in New Zealand. Even tiny things like Jean's locker number is a reference to the address of Rooster Teeth's old studio. Whatever unique story and potential there is in here, it's taking refuge behind an immense patchwork quilt of references to other things they like, other things their company made, and eventually references to the few things people seemed to like about the show itself. One of the standout moments that people really liked about early RWBY is the part where Nora pokes Ren's nose and says boop. People really liked that, because it's a genuinely simple and cute moment that you don't need to know Rooster Teeth lore to enjoy, and isn't trying and failing to emulate something else. It's just nice, you know? That's good, it's cute. People also really liked the way Penny introduced herself, because it's genuinely a really nice moment. Like, Weiss accidentally knocks her over, and she just goes,
Salutations!
That's funny, that's good writing, that's characterization. It's immediately clear that something is up with Penny. It's good. Please stop being sometimes good and getting my hopes up. So, of course, in addition to selling merchandise that quotes these moments, in the second season Nora starts wearing a boop shirt. They don't have room to make the prom stuff interesting, or to connect Monty's fights properly and make them feel like part of a story, but they had room to go, hey, remember when she said boop? Well, it's in stores now. The show is just a continuous list of references to other things that were good. And by
I feel like how do you make the argument that, like, giving Nora a boop shirt was somehow, like, energy that could have been spent on the plot? It's just character, like, she needed a different shirt in that scene, so they gave her a shirt. Like, she had a different outfit in that scene than she does in other... So, like, how is the... I don't know, like... And I talked about the prom stuff earlier, or the dance stuff earlier, but, like, he completely... Like, he complains a lot about how the dance has, like, no plot part of it. He really sort of lays into it as a sort of a waste of time that could have been used for other stuff. But, like, he ignores a lot of the character stuff that goes on with Yang and Blake in the lead up to the dance. And he also completely ignores, if we're talking just pure plot, right? Which is not the character work that he is saying RWBY doesn't do. That it does do, very much so. It's very much a character-driven show. But, like, there's a whole important thing going on during the dance where Cinder infiltrates Beacon using the fact that everyone is distracted by the dance to plant a virus that is incredibly important to the upcoming storyline. And RWBY slips out of the dance because she's not having fun there. And she pursues Cinder of her own agency. So the idea of things happening at RWBY rather than her making choices, that's another thing that is, like, addressed there that's just completely skipped over. It's all this omitted context in a way that really doesn't feel good.
by the middle of season 2, volume 2, it's referencing the few good parts of itself. Writing, like the word writing, is often used to mean a lot of different things. But at its core, writing means making decisions and risking making the wrong one. What's acutely frustrating about RWBY is that Miles and Kerry don't necessarily always make bad decisions. It's that they have done almost everything they can to avoid making them, to abdicate the responsibility of having to write a story of their own. They don't understand exactly why the things they're borrowing actually were enjoyable, which makes it worse, but centrally they're in this mess because they're going out of their way not to be unique, and thereby failing to do interesting things with, or apparently even notice, the potential that an original animated work made for the internet with no oversight can have. The show could have been anything, and it...
That's just... God, to accuse RWBY of all shows of being, like, totally unoriginal and doing nothing bold or interesting. There's nothing like RWBY out there right now, especially in the Western market. like, especially in like America and the American market, like, there's nothing like RWBY right now. Everything else is so much safer than RWBY. And he has the guts to call it unoriginal. And, like, again, there's this whole thing of, like, oh, things that, like, are paying homage to these other shows, they fail at doing the thing that those other shows were doing. And the assumption there is that must be what they were going for. It's not taking RWBY on its own terms. Like, if you are watching RWBY as how well does it succeed at the things other shows do, yeah, it's gonna fail. If you're watching it as Avatar The Last Airbender fan fiction, or an Avatar remake, or trying to copy from Cowboy Bebop, yes, it's going to fail at those things, because that's not what it is. So, you know, that's all very frustrating, watching this.
Wants to be anything other than itself, and that wasted potential will never not be tremendously disappointing. When you take no risks and try to say very little while looking like you're saying something important, you get a story element like the Faunus.
Alright, here we go. Oh boy. Now let me preface this by saying the Faunus storylines have flaws. They do. They're not perfect, but they're not as bad as people say. And oh boy, let's go into this, because I'm sure it's going to be a lot of fun to go through. And there actually is a criticism that actually I think would have been worth going into here, in terms of not fully thinking things through, that he doesn't talk about at all. And I'll talk about that when it's relevant.
By later in the first volume, we finally sat in a classroom and learned what the Faunus are, and also seen the bully character mistreating one of them. The Faunus are a stand-in for the oppressed races of the world. Yes, that is correct. I did not misspeak. These guys have to talk about racism now, and I am here for it. I've heard it mentioned that this aspect of the story was originally conceived by Monty, but unfortunately the story is being written by the men who brought you My Semblance is Polarity? The big twist in Volume 1 is that Blake is a Faunus. She gets mad at Weiss for being a racist and runs away and dramatically takes off her bow to reveal cat ears. In addition to her normal ears. Have you guessed which fairy tale character Blake is based on yet? Well, I'll tell you, she's Beauty and the Beast. Ugh. Now, I don't know about you.
Why is that bad? He just put a groan like that's some horrible thing. Again, with the Monty erasure in regards to the writing decisions, Monty also participated in the writing and directing. He and Carey had more input in writing John than Miles did. So, the way it worked in the early years, as far as I'm aware, right, was that Miles and Carey did generally do the bulk of the writing, and Monty focused on the animating. However, it is important to understand that the general beats of the story were developed together. Right? Like, the outline of the story, what actually, the direction of everything, was developed together. Regarding your point about RWBY's uniqueness, I don't fully agree. In terms of original indie web animation for fantasy action, it's unique. In terms of original indie web animation in general, okay, fair. Indie animation lately has been taking off in a way that I did not take into account there. I guess I'm speaking in sort of mainstream stuff. But you're right. I didn't take indie animation into account. And there's some great indie stuff right now. Some really great stuff. I still don't think there's anything quite like RWBY. But that doesn't mean that there isn't stuff that's as good as RWBY, or that's as unique as RWBY. It's just that RWBY is not like those things either. But in terms of the stuff that has as much like name recognition as like RWBY does, that can operate in the mainstream, I still think RWBY it stands above a lot of other stuff. Obviously, like Hazbin Hotel has managed to break into the mainstream, and that's great. Lackadaisy has like the potential to do so. Obviously, we've gotten a lot of good stuff. You're right, and I back off from sort of what I've said about RWBY being unlike. Like, I do think it's unlike anything else, but not in terms of... but I back off what I'm saying about how it's less safe than anything else out there. There's definitely some great stuff that is not playing it safe. I would, however... I love Murder Drones, but I would argue that RWBY is better than Murder Drones. But that comes down to personal opinion about whether or not it's better or worse or anything like that. So that's not really an argument worth having. The funny thing is that Blake is one of the few who take from the same source. Most other examples are usually from two different sources. Example of RWBY is both Little Red Riding Hood and Dorothy, both of which come from different fairy tales. True. Anyways, apparently for hbom, her being both Beauty and the Beast is something worth groaning over.
But RWBY didn't initially strike me as a show that was trying to be about something this heavy. I mean, for the most part, it's been an adventure story about kids beating up monsters and bad guys. So when this happened, I don't know, it seemed a little weird. Like, is this particular show, with the tone you've set so far, really ready for something as serious as this?
I'm queen of the castle, I'm queen of the castle.
Like, we're in the middle of this fairly light-hearted show. So light-hearted, characters have a magic shield in fights so they can't get hurt too badly. And then in a classroom, the comedy fast-talking, coffee-drinking professor guy, voiced by the guy who plays Caboose in Red vs. Blue, starts to discuss the horrific tragedy of the mistreatment of the Faunus.
Prior to the Faunus Rights Revolution, more popularly known as the Faunus War,
They begin to explore the topic of racism by using the comedy silly talkie man.
now, have any among you been subjugated or discriminated because of your Faunus heritage?
The issue of racism is a big part of the rest of the story, or at least it tries to be. A central component to the plot is the White Fang, a group of Faunus who do crimes and terrorism in the name of Faunus liberation. The White Fang are presented as antagonists in the story. They work with the bad man from Volume 1 and do a bunch of crimes, including the train thing. A lot of the goons getting fought in fights in Volumes 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are White Fang members. When the main characters aren't fighting Grimm, they're beating the shit out of in-universe minorities. But it's okay, you know they're bad, because they all talk in the evil voice.
Finally, I get to kill a Shmi.
Oh, I think he might be a bad guy. Once again, we're seeing the writing...
So, listen. I think that, early on, there is absolutely a bit of an issue of reducing the White Fang to generic punching bags. I think that's genuinely an issue early on. And I really appreciate that in Volume 4 and Volume 5, we get to see more actual people who are part of the White Fang. Like, even the antagonists in Menagerie, like when one of those brothers dies, it's a bad moment. You feel that loss, even though it's someone you've sort of been rooting against. So they course correct on that a bit, in my opinion. But I think in the early volumes, sure, yeah, I think this is a legitimate criticism. And they didn't really have the time or budget to really dig into this in the way that they wanted to. Or that, maybe even not that they wanted to, but that they deserved, that the topic deserved. Like, yeah, there's legitimate criticism to have here, and I think that, honestly, you know, you know, a lot of the criticism for the White Fang arc gets focused on Volume 4 and Volume 5, especially Volume 5, but I would argue that Volume 4 and Volume 5 actually do a significant course correction on the Faunus and White Fang storyline. They introduce characters from multiple perspectives and give weight to their life, even when they're just bad guys. And like the fact that Adam was going to blow up other White Fang members in Volume 5 is a huge issue. Like, it actively changes the White Fang that he was going to sacrifice all of them to, just because he never cared about them. I genuinely believe that Volume 4 and Volume 5 were a significant course correction on the White Fang, even though they get the lion's share of the criticism for it. I also think that it's important to talk about the fact that the Faunus are not racism allegory. They're not a one-to-one allegory for any minority. And when we look at it through this is racism allegory, yeah, it falls apart. But it will do that for any minority because it's an in-universe minority that has different issues. Now, here are some legitimate criticisms for the Faunus. One, the lack of understanding of microaggressions. People saying things like, like just referring to their animal parts in ways that are like, oh, like that guy was a cat, or like that was, or like even like, like the whole, oh, Blake loves like tuna thing. Like, you are reducing them to their animal part rather than treating them as a full person that is simply of another deviation of humanity, and not in a degenerative sense, but just in a part of, not as a deviant, but in terms of life just evolving in different ways. So, like, the lack of understanding of microaggressions, valid criticism. Here's the big one that I would talk about if I were doing a video criticizing RWBY. There is a really long history of specifically, especially with black people, but race in general, but especially black people, reducing them to animal status. And like turning them into animals in like movies and stuff like that, where they don't get to be people. And you could argue on one hand that the Faunus being part animal deliberately draws attention to the way that kind of stuff is spread, where you have people who are different, and then you sort of like build it on that issue, actually, of like calling Faunus animals is still incorrect, even though they have animal parts. But I would also say that personally, I think that there's a legitimate thing to talk about in terms of, like, are they kind of fueling that a little bit? That long history of comparing minorities to non-human entities, to non-human species. Are they fueling that? Maybe. I think it's worth talking about. But that's not in this video.
problems that made Jean's character so terrible creeping in here. This argument between Weiss and Blake comes to a head because, at least initially, Weiss was written to be kinda racist.
The White Fang. What an awful bunch of degenerates.
I don't particularly trust the Faunus.
Her family profited from exploitative Faunus labor and maybe slavery, but it's hard to tell exactly what because the show is written badly.
Infamous for its controversial labor forces.
And she seems to take the opportunity to be shitty about Faunus when it presents itself.
Stop calling him a degenerate. He's a person.
Oh, I'm sorry. Would you like me to stop referring to the trash can as a trash can?
But at some point down the line, the writers were smart enough to see a problem with writing a main character with this flaw. Weiss being racist might affect the audience's ability to relate to the character, wouldn't it? The creators want the audience to like this lady as they go on adventures with her and watch her dote on Pup Boy Bebop. How many members of your audience are really gonna want to cosplay as the Weiss supremacist? So her beliefs about the Faunus are quietly dropped off screen, and we are to assume she's anti-racist in future volumes. She just says, hey, whatever, we're a team, let's work together now. And then in the next volume, this side of her character is quietly forgotten. Knowing this show, I presume a man told her off screen not to be a racist anymore, and she went, okay. In volume 2, she says she wants to become a huntress, specifically to try to do better than her family name has been in the past, and she doesn't like what her father is doing, implicitly saying she became a fighter who protects the world because she wants to not be like her racist family. This is done instead of having her grapple with her prejudice towards a group of people, and growing and changing and learning. You know, akin to what a story would do. They made her racist and then rewrote her to never have been racist. The writers are far too precious about their characters to permit them to have, like, flaws or lives or...
Whoa. Okay. There's some legitimate issues about how quickly that was dropped. Maybe it could have used some more time. You're not... Like, the idea that they don't let their characters have flaws is something else. Like, that's... God. Of course they have flaws. Just because Weiss grew out of her racism, which you could talk about the execution. Fine. But just because Weiss grew out of that racism does not mean that that the characters don't have flaws. And in terms of her wanting to right her family's wrongs, like, she can still be, she could be aware of those problems and want to do better and not actually be the kind of person who can do that yet. It's not bad for her to still have to deal with her privilege, even if she intends to do better than her father. And that's what this scene is to me, at least. It's not, I was never racist, and I've always resented my dad's controversial labor forces. To me, it's, I know my dad's a piece of shit, and I still had bias against the Faunus for the way that they had affected my family, and the way that I've been taught to be, and the fact that, you know, I was in a bubble. I'd never met a Faunus. And I think that for me, the reason that Volume 1 does work, at least part of it, is that Weiss now actually knows and has grown to trust a Faunus. And when she finds out that someone she knows and trusts, Blake, is a Faunus, it starts to crack her worldview, and she realizes that she needs to drop the way she thinks about Faunus, because she has a teammate, someone she trusts, who is a Faunus, and therefore, ultimately, she's not right about the Faunus. She now has hard proof of that. And there is, like, real-world evidence about how, like, for instance, a family, like a parent might have some really hard really bad beliefs about trans people or queer people, and then maybe their child comes out as trans or queer in some other way, and it doesn't always work. To be clear, there's some parents who just stay bad and don't support their kids, but there are other parents who start rethinking the way that they deal with this stuff. Like, it is known that being around diverse people and getting to know them, rather than being able to distance yourself from them and to other them, actively helps, like, deal with bigotry. Even if it were just a retcon. A retcon to avoid including actually harmful people in the fan base is better than giving that sort of person a backdoor into an otherwise upstanding show. Good point. And yes, Faboover, the effects of exposure at play. Being exposed to other kinds of lives and other kinds of living and other existences, and seeing the humanity and the value in those up close, has an impact. And that, personally, even if it wasn't executed perfectly, that's what I see Volume 1 Weiss going through, and why she comes out the other end saying, I don't care that you're Faunus. Because ultimately, this is still Blake. This is still her teammate. And the fact that she's a Faunus, you know, you want a much more subtle example of exposure in RWBY. Look at how Torchwick treated the Faunus in Volume 1 and compare it to him at the end of Volume 2. I will have to look into that.
Or even personalities beyond cookie-cutter heroics.
I love books.
They don't need to learn anything or grow, which makes them fundamentally uninteresting. And in the same way, the writers are far too precious about their world itself. They want their world to not be so fundamentally flawed that a group like the White Fang is necessary. You see, the issue here is the White Fang are basically in the right. The Faunus are an oppressed people whose struggle for liberation and equality is, immediately, the instant you actually think about it,
they don't want the world to be imperfect? The entire world is blown up at the end of Volume 3 because a bunch of people in the positions of power were unable to actively deal with their own bullshit and be honest with people. Like, clearly, the system was not good. The people in charge were not equipped to do that, and they had a lot of personal flaws that they refused to deal with that created a situation that was really bad. I don't know how they're talking about, like, how do you have a world that goes through what happens at the end of Volume 3 and say that it's a world that's that the creators think is too precious, that they treat it too preciously. And not to mention all the figures in authority who are all really, like, challenged in really, really passionate ways. Like, they are, like, made to face the effects of their actions and grow. Like, the authority figures have to grow, or they are the villains. Or at least the antagonists. Which is not always what happens when you have, like, multiple generations and you have the heroes that are part of the younger generation, you know?
the morally correct side of the argument. Spoilers for real life, but we recently discovered in lab tests on mice that racism is wrong. But like, if you have a movement whose purpose is to liberate an oppressed group, that means your society has some incredibly deep-set problems, right? People who need liberating from something? You know, the Black Panthers didn't pop into existence because things were fine in the 60s, right? Oh, I really hate H-Bomb's political videos, but I love his media stuff, it's way better. Ha! I tricked you! But Miles and Kerry realized, at some point, that if you
I feel exactly the opposite for what it's worth. I mean, that's not even relevant to any of this, but like, his political videos are actually well researched. And like, what I've seen of his media analysis stuff is just not very good.
introduce a group like this, then the main society of your story is a systemically racist one, and a huge portion of your main characters would be tacitly implicated in this by living in that society and not doing anything about the way those people are treated. Basically, they'd be writing a pretty grim story where almost everyone is, on some level, racist or at least okay with an unequal system, because a lot of shit would need to change if there's a group like the White Fang running around, and anyone sitting around enjoying the status quo instead of doing anything wouldn't be a heroic or positive character in this setting. In other words, you'd have a bit too much social commentary, making everyone really uncomfortable about the parallels to real-world history, and in some places the real-world present, which would be an interesting story. I'd like a story like that, really, but which would kind of suck the fun out of your anime cartoon about killing monsters with sci-fi rocket fists.
I do just want to say that, Volume 8 wasn't out yet. Volume 8 wasn't out yet. So, like, a lot of the most hardcore political things... Well, actually, no, hold on. Volume 7 was out when he made this. Or maybe not when he was writing it, but by the time it was released, Volume 7 was... Because he had said that they were gonna release Volume 8 soon. Volume 7 had some really deep political stuff. It did not hold back. At all. But, like, he sometimes brings up post-Volume 3 stuff, but not, like, a lot. But he also still talks about all these issues as if they're issues with the entire show. Also, Remnant is, like, really fucked up when you sit down and think about it. Even before the show started proper, it wasn't a good place to live in. Yeah, and part of the story is actually the character... Like, I want to be clear here, right? The first 3 volumes are a bubble, right? They are the characters in a sort of safe place where they don't really have to think about the harshness of the world. Like, that is a very intentional thing. Beacon is a safe environment. They have backup. They have, people who can teach them how to be huntsmen. They have support. And there is a very intentional breaking of that support with the end of Volume 3. Because now they're dealing with the world in just all of the harshest ways that it is. They don't have a bubble anymore. They don't get to be protected from that harshness. They're now in it. So this world building was really damn good. Volume 7, Volume 8. Mostly Volume 7 did a great job in that department. RWBY, Penny, what are you talking about? The world is at peace. Penny, that's not what General Ironwood said. RWBY is akin to a coming-of-age story. Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, it's not just akin to a coming-of-age story, it is a coming-of-age story. It's about these characters growing up. That's something Monty was very upfront about. That's why he wanted to do long-form storytelling, to explore these characters in many levels over long periods of time.
People aren't gonna buy your boop t-shirts if they're sad about racism. So the writer's objective was to make a show which explores racism, but without making anyone too uncomfortable, without risking actually saying anything about our society, and without risking saying that the White Fang might have a point, so everyone can have fun watching people beat them up, because they're the bad guys. We wouldn't want any implications to think about. So firstly, the mistreatment that appears in the story is always incredibly minor. It's established that the Faunus have already had a civil rights movement of sorts and been granted equality, but just aren't really getting it yet in some places.
Despite being promised equality, the Faunus were subjected to discrimination and hate.
Some specific people are still kinda racist. Faunus get bullied by some people in school. There's a no Faunus sign on one bar. There's nothing wrong with the system anymore. Individual racists are the problem. Since we aren't living in a racist nightmare world, we can feel less bad about the status quo of the setting, and more okay with the idea that the White Fang are bad. But even then, they still...
No, it's just more... It's just more like the world we actually live in. Where minorities have been promised equal rights, but haven't gotten them yet. It doesn't have to be a racist nightmare world for that to be meaningful. Now, again, like, if, you know, the whole thing with the White Fang, it wasn't perfectly handled. And it needed those other voices that came in Volume 4 and Volume 5.
Have a roughly sympathetic goal. If a shadowy group were blowing up the businesses of people who refuse to serve Faunus, or attacking people with unethical Faunus labor practices, which I assume is what a controversial labor force is, half the people watching might not realize these are supposed to be the bad guys. You can't have a story where the liberation movement has a point, because then you're writing a story that's slightly more complex than help, we need to stop the bad guys. And
that's what Volume 1 through 3 were. Again, like, he brings in the other stuff, post Volume 3 stuff, when it serves his arguments. But when it doesn't, he leaves it out. And that's very annoying. I mean, obviously, you know, he's not going to bring in something that actively disproves his argument, but you get my point. But, like, Volume 1 through 3 are more simple, intentionally so, because they are before the characters have to deal with the real world. Like, that is... Like, before it deals with the real conflict, the real, like, everything. It is important that before Volume 4, things don't feel as complex. Because we are coming at this from the position that the characters are in, which is that they are not aware of this wider, harsher world yet. Claiming the world being at peace is actually lying. Yeah, fair, Bardock. I guess so. But also, right, like, RWBY doesn't know Ironwood at that point. She is... Oh, whoops. And, like, she doesn't have any, like, evidence of any of that stuff. So I don't think she's at the point where, like, at that point in the story, she's not at the point where, like, she would investigate that kind of thing exactly. Because she just doesn't have enough to go off of.
It's not fun. If you're writing a story for tiny babies, you want to be writing a generally okay world that's being threatened by evil outsiders.
Tiny babies.
Monsters you could have already had be the main villains. So to add an extra level of moral simplification, they have the White Fang be recently under new leadership that are way more violent and pro-terrorism than normal.
5 years ago, our leader stepped down, and a new one took his place. A new leader with a new way of thinking.
So okay, now they might have a point, but they're just going about it all wrong with this terrorism terrorism stuff. Now we can all get behind how they're the bad guys, even if racism is wrong and they maybe have a point. Oh, I think she might be the bad guy, etc. You get the point. The story amounts to a long series of justifications for why the organization whose stated goal is the liberation of an oppressed people can be thought of as the antagonists. The White Fang used to be good guys, like agitating for progress in a nice way, politely asking for racism to end, like good second-class citizens. But then a new leader stepped in who was more violent and aggressive, and now they're the bad guys and not respectable anymore. The problem is you're now effectively writing a story in which the most prominent villains are an oppressed people who are reacting wrong to being oppressed. Yeah, sure, racism is bad, but you're...
I do just want to say here, there is a meaningful story that is told in RWBY about the vulnerability of fear and anger to movements that promise progress but don't deliver it, right? Roman promises the Faunus revenge, basically, against humans. Specifically, he promises the White Fang revenge against humans, as does Adam Taurus, of course. And they are vulnerable to that. And, like, well, again, in Volume 1 through 3, I don't like how generic bad guy the Faunus are. They're just sort of a generic army that can be punched. I do think that the story about well-meaning movements falling victim to fear and anger is really valuable. Like, really valuable. And, like, without going into too much stuff happening right now in the real world, it's very relevant. And very important, and a lot of people haven't learned it.
Supposed to take it up with your congressman, guys. There's no nuance here. The White Fang are written to be as unequivocally in the wrong as possible. The main White Fang member we're shown is that guy who didn't care about killing innocent civilians with bombs, and who later turns out to want to kill all humans because he sees his people as the superior race.
The Faunus are the dominant species of this planet.
Oh, also he wants to kill his ex-girlfriend for breaking up with him over the fact he's evil. The need to write an obvious villain into the story has burned away any relevance to the issues the show was supposedly trying to explore with this aspect of the story.
I will make it my mission to destroy you.
Why is it bad that the bad guy is a clear bad guy? In my opinion, you have not made that argument, sir. You have not made a good argument as to why it is bad for a bad guy to be a clear bad guy. And Adam Taurus is actually a well-written, abusive ex. He is well-written. He is awful, and I hate him. But he's well-written. Not just in terms of being hateable, but in terms of the way that, like, the way we learn that he has, you know, abused Blake and manipulated her and gaslit her, we can see how that kind of thing also makes him the kind of person who would try and take over a genuinely good movement like this, and who would appeal to people's anger and frustrations. It's actually an interesting story about how, like, frankly, insecure men who want to possess women are actually kind of on the same page a lot of the time as really bad movements, and are willing to prey on a lot of genuinely reasonable anger to make themselves feel more secure.
Everything you love.
What is the show trying to say? Racism is bad, but don't kill civilians or your ex-girlfriend? Okay, if you want to talk about real-world issues, you should actually do it. And if you don't, You don't have to. You don't have to have a take on racism. And you especially don't have one when you set your story in a fantasy world where racism is over and the real bad guy is a protest group that turned evil.
I never wanted this! I wanted equality!
No one said racism was over. In fact, you very specifically noted that there were still racists around. And they were still pointing out that, like, they weren't given the rights that they were promised, which again is like the real world, where people have technically, legally been given the same rights, but that doesn't mean that they're treated better, that they're treated the way that they've been promised in practice. Sounds like he's more arguing that the bad guys have more of a morally just motivation than the heroes in the early seasons, but again, this is my first exposure to it. I mean, yeah. I think they do. In some ways. Because, like I said, the heroes are in a bubble in Volume 1 through 3. They are looking at things through a very simplistic lens. And it's only when they are forced outside of that bubble that they start really taking on the complexities of the world. They start thinking about what their responsibilities are and how to actually go about things in ways that aren't just beating up bad guys. There is literally a scene in Volume 6 where RWBY is actively chastised for thinking about her role as a huntress as fighting, as basically beating up monsters. Because ultimately that doesn't really... That's not the right way to think about it. You're there to save lives. You're there to help people, not to beat up monsters. And that is something that the characters have to learn. They have to grow out of this simplistic mindset that they were in especially Volume 1 and Volume 2, where they could just beat up the bad guys. It was all romantic, like the stories that RWBY read. They saw it in this romantic way where everything could kind of be simple, and they would be heroes. But when you go into the real world, it's more complicated than that. So, again, like, it just feels like he's taking this thing that was kind of actually important and pointing it out as a flaw. And it's just not that simple. Because RWBY isn't that simple, but he's saying that because there was this point before everything got complicated, I don't know. At least that's what it comes across as. Again, I don't want to, like, accuse him as anything, but, like, listen. I would say that the White Fang did genuinely have better points than the heroes in Volume 1 through 3. Because the heroes were not dealing with the real world yet. But the White Fang was coming from the real world that had all these issues. You know, it's like Bardock was saying about how, like, you know, RWBY and co. had been fed these ideas that the world was completely at peace, that everything was fine. Like, they were told that the world was experiencing an unprecedented time of peace. That's what they were told. And that there was instead this whole powder keg issue. Things building up, problems that were being sort of pushed away. And we also hear, like, bits of propaganda, like, you know, like, oh, the Faunus civil rights movement, or, like, more commonly called the Faunus War. Like, that's little bits of propaganda that are like, these characters were not really heroes yet. They were still romanticizing everything. That's part of the story. It's not a flaw in the writing, I mean. It's not a flaw in the writing. It's a flaw in the characters. an intentional one.
So, hey, remember Velvet? That one character who seems like some members of the team intended to be more of a part of the story, and then she just wasn't? It makes it just a little bit more egregious that the story is kind of about the persecution of her fucking race? Like, how do you fuck this up this badly? And for the record, that is not how human male teenagers would treat bunny girls if they were real. They would wait on them on hand and foot and beg them to step on me. Absolutely no one was holding a gun to Miles and Kerry's heads and saying to make the show about how they think Malcolm X could have toned it down a little. They did this by choice. They were given free rein to write a story and connect the dots on Monty's fights, and this is what they made? Guys, I don't think you have as much to say on this topic as you initially thought.
You know, instead of seeing, oh, you know, the humans have a side, they should just respect us more, he turned into, yeah, let's get rid of the humans and then they'll respect us because they'll be dead.
Let me just read that back to you just to make that more clear. He turned into, yeah, let's get rid of the humans, and then they'll respect us, because they'll be dead. Kerry, are you sure you want to go with this? There's also the problem of representation. I'm not going to criticize the show's diversity or lack of it that much, because I don't think that's really my criticism to make, and I don't want to risk making it poorly on behalf of people who could say something better about it than me. There are doubtless plenty of people a whole lot less white than me who like the show and don't think it has a representation problem, although that's not saying much. Most brands of literal cracker are browner than me. Oh shit, my fucking laundry. Besides, I'm sure some people will tell you there's plenty of black people in the first season. However, I can't help but notice that they have managed to write a show that tries, fails, but tries to deal with the impact of racism on a group of people in society, but in such a way that they didn't have to have too many non-white characters.
Again, if you actually look at RWBY's cast after Volume 3, but especially after, like, Volume 5, there's so many more people because the writers learn. They learn. There are a lot more people of color now on the cast. A lot more. There's Maria, there's Oscar, there's Emerald. Let me think who else. Obviously, Ilya was there. I'd have to go back into the cast and actually look, but there's a bunch more. Obviously, there's just a lot of characters, and they introduced a bunch of them already, so they can't go back. But, like, to the best of their ability, they absolutely do. Sage Prom not even consider the possibility that Monty also could have not been great on writing the faunus racism subplot. Coming from an Asian family, plenty racist ourselves. That's also a fair point. He also, by the way, leaves out the fact that Miles is mixed race. He's white passing, but he's not white. So, you know, it's just a thing of, like, oh, that probably was informing stuff. Like, Blake is 100% a good allegory for, like, mixed race. For someone who can pass. I have no doubt that Miles integrated his own experience into Blake. I have no doubt about it. Something is coming up that's really going to really aggravate me. This whole video aggravates me, but I look forward to seeing what exactly it is.
Instead, they invented a fictional race which consists almost entirely in the story of white women with cute animal ears and a cool buff white guy with a tail. This was a really clever decision. It turns out the way to get weebs to understand racism is to make the target a cat girl. The White Fang are like the Black Panthers, but with the emphasis on the panther. I mean, sure, regular racism is over in Remnant, but here in the real world, if there were too many black characters, some of your audience members might start to smell politics. Now who'll buy our boop shirts? Black Lives Matter, especially when they're white people with vague animal characteristics. But, you know, we can't risk having too many people of color in our show about racism. By the way, you know this animated bit I showed you? That's Blake telling her backstory to Sun. Yes, Sun, another Faunus. She is telling the backstory of a movement Faunus are intimately aware of, that Sun says he knows about.
Are you familiar with the White Fang?
Of course. I don't think there's a faunus on the planet who hasn't heard of them.
Which describes the history of the treatment of faunus to one of the only other faunus in the story. Exposition, guys! Have her be telling this to someone who might not know it. Like any other character in the show.
Okay, fair criticism.
Any of this?
God, even Sun's asking why she's telling him. And what's up with all of these teens preparing elaborate speeches about their lives and the world? If you try and get away with a monologue that long in my household, your parents tell you you're a horrible son and they hate.
Miles is mixed. I think it's Miles. It's either Miles or Carrie. And I'm now questioning whether I got it right. Let me look it up real quick. Yes, Miles Luna is a Mexican-American writer, director, and voice actor based in Austin, Texas. He's Mexican-American. But he's very white passing. Miles is the mixed race one, yeah. Yeah, that's also true, Bardock. The thing about Sun is that he was only aware of what the white fang is now. I don't think he knew about what it was before. Like, yeah, I think that's fair. So, you know. But I also think that it is a little awkward in terms of exposition here. They were still figuring things out in Volume 1, which is totally fine. It's okay to not... Like, I said this, I think, before a lot of you were here. But, like, it is totally normal for shows to have 1 or 2 seasons before they really understand what they are. Especially at least 1 season. Most shows have at least 1 season where they're figuring themselves out and, like, still need to listen to feedback and stuff about what works and what doesn't. You know? Yeah, agreed, though, about Sun. He's not really the most aware guy. He's certainly not the type to really get involved in political issues, at least here in Volume 1. He actively avoids complex issues. Obviously, he gets involved later. But here in Volume 1, he's absolutely the kind of guy to just not get involved with anything that makes him uncomfortable.
When you remove all of the moral and ethical dimensions from a story, the story disappears too. When it comes down to it, the White Fang are a bunch of angry bad guys in masks, and all this talk about how they're just reacting to mistreatment, but don't worry guys, things are fine, they're just overreacting, is boring window dressing on a story that's basically about how we have to stop the bad men from blowing up the city and stealing all of the precious jewels. The gang gleefully kill dozens of White Fang members, throwing them off a train at high speed where their remains will be shattered and smashed into a pulp, unburied.
No! Because of Aura. The thing you... Do you know what Aura is? Do you know what Aura is? Did you watch the show? Okay, let's keep going.
In a collapsing tunnel covered in monsters and explosives, and then later the only exit from this monster-infested tunnel is sealed shut, trapping any of the survivors inside to die horrible deaths. And sure, maybe they experienced racism and suffering, but they decided to be evil, so they got what was coming. If you kill one of these guys, your conscience is clean. Oh look, that one was black. Do you feel represented yet? I'm not saying you should have sympathy for these characters and that killing them is wrong. What I'm saying is, it should be at least slightly more complicated than this, and the fact the story is written so that these characters are just evil is a massive flaw. It's like in The Dark Knight Rises. Bane basically has a point. Gotham is corrupt and the people are oppressed by a system that seeks to profit from them and find new ways to spy on and criminalize them if they resist. The Occupy Wall Street movement had a lot to say, and a lot of it is true.
It's a stock exchange. There's no money you can steal.
Sorry, folks. It was, let's see. Sound is also from Vacchio, which is probably the most faunus friendly of the four kingdoms. And please don't ask questions that have a very obvious answer when watching videos like this. Trust me, I try every time. It never ends well for my mental state. Over. Hold on. Members of the White Fang did die as a result of that incident. Cinder and Co. acknowledge as much at the end of Volume 2 by saying some of the White Fang members didn't make it out. Okay. Alright. Fair. Alright. I will retract my statement. However, I do think it's important to note that, that it is, there is an in-world thing that means that doing some of this stuff doesn't hurt people as much as it could in our world. Also, it is 12:31 a.m., so I should probably start being quiet because I was just bothering someone, and I should, yeah, which means there's just a little bit left, about half an hour. Let's finish up this little bit and find a place to stop for the night, and then I will find another time to do the rest. Finish it up.
Really? And why are you people here?
But if you put that in your film, that means something's deeply wrong with your actual society. So Bane also wants to kill everyone with a nuke. So now when Batman beats the shit out of him and everyone who stands in his way, it's not because Batman is a tool of a corrupt establishment. It's because he's heroically stopping this definitely bad guy from killing everyone. The moral complexity of the story exists purely to sound cool and get thrown away before it gets anyone to think about the actual problems with our world. The Dark Knight Rises is complete bollocks, because a villain who might have a point is consciously rewritten into a bad man in a mask with a big bomb who Batman needs to punch to win. Yay, the good guys hitting the bad guy. Don't think about Wall Street. The writers of RWBY want to look like they're talking about serious real-world problems, because that seems cool and clever and meaningful, but they don't want to run the risk of spoiling the cartoon fun, and they certainly don't want to risk the people in their audience who think talking about racism is for SJWs to stop watching. So we're left with generic masked bad guys who want to use a train to blow up a city and try to cut off one of our main characters' heads.
Okay, I will just say one last thing, which is, I don't know what he's talking about right-wing people loving RWBY and Miles and Carrie trying to keep them in the audience. This is another thing where, like, I don't think he's spent any time in the RWBY fandom. RWBY is absolutely a huge target for right-wing grifters. They love talking about how awful, you know, Ironwood was treated and how awful Adam was treated by the writers. Like, it's a huge thing. The idea that Miles and Carrie are trying to keep right-wing people in the RWBY audience is absurd. Also, what Weber said is an important cause in the same scene. They ask if they can still use the Fang, only for Adam to go, no, but they will follow me. The stuff with Bane isn't like that at all. Bane might have had a point, but his methods to achieve change were horrible. That's what makes him the bad guy, regardless of his good points. Right, and the thing about the White Fang is it's an organization, which is why we get to explore people in it later. Whereas Bane is an individual who speaks for an entire thing. The Faunus are a whole group. They're a race. They're a species of their own. So you get to see different perspectives in that group, in that minority. So the classic villain tries to do something that seems good on paper, they go way too far to get their villain trope. Yeah, and I will say that the White Fang falls into that early on, and then there is more nuance added over time. Alright folks, this is where I gotta stop for now because I can't keep people up. It's 12:30 in the morning, and I'm louder than I should be at this time. So keep your eye out for the final part, I suppose. And I also want to super duper thank folks for I got my first Patreon member, Ven364. I don't know which of you is that, but whoever that is, but whoever it is just, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You're my first patron, and it means a lot. Have an amazing night or morning or whatever part of the time zone it is. And I'll see you guys. Speaking as a brown leftist Florida man, I got more than a few criticism about the way Adam and Ironwood are handled, and in my opinion, butchered, and my critiques ain't right-wing. Well, I would be interested in listening to those takes, actually. I'm not saying everyone who dislikes the way they were handled is right-wing, to be clear. I'm saying there are a lot of people who get very attached to those characters and sort of see them as like emasculated and ruined in ways that are very specifically part of the right-wing pipeline. So yeah, anyways, I'm gonna wrap up now. Thank you so much, everyone. This was actually really great. It was great to have so many people talking to me here, and it was just great. Thank you so much. And I will talk to you all and see you all soon.